Good morning. I hope I'm being heard. My name is Mindy Reiser, and I'm on the steering committee of the Science and Human Rights Coalition of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And we're delighted to share with you a really wonderful panel who is going to talk about community science, local knowledge, and scientific tools that are joining together to document urban health hazards. I think that we are now going to begin our webinar description. Let me start. The American Interstate Highway System, with its beginning in the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 and construction continuing through the 1980s, has significantly reshaped the American landscape with consequences that were little considered at its inception. Highway planners decided that Interstate I-10, which was to link New Orleans to the cross-country highway system, required an elevated extension which would go through a section of the city. That extension, which is at the core of what we're going to be discussing this morning, was put in place over community protests, and it cut through a part of the city of New Orleans called North Claiborne Avenue, which is a key business corridor and a gathering place for the area's Black and Creole community. The extension not only dug up the area's stately and cherished oak trees, but also tore the neighborhood apart, bringing significant health consequences to the area, a result of the air and noise pollution and the never-ending traffic flows. The Claiborne Avenue Alliance, a coalition of area residents, property, and business owners, came together in 2017 to raise awareness of the negative impact of the Claiborne Expressway and to advocate for change. Working with the Alliance, scientists joined with community members to document the effects of the I-10 Expressway and to share their expertise with community members, including local public school students, as you will learn later this morning. With this group working together, strong evidence of the toxicity brought by the expressway would be made available to the public and to New Orleans officials. The AAAS Science and Human Rights Coalition will bring together through this webinar the principal collaborators in this community science effort. Amy Stelly, an artist, planner, and educator, and a major catalyst of the Claiborne Avenue Alliance. Raj Pandya, director of the American Geophysical Union's Thriving Earth Exchange, which provided support to the Alliance. Mimi Spahn-Sattler, an educator with public labs who worked directly with the community in measuring the toxicity brought by the expressway. And Adrienne Kettner, a faculty member of Louisa State University School of Public Health, who brought her expertise in environmental epidemiology to documenting the public health consequences of the expressway. And now we are going to go to the panelists who are the core of this morning's discussion. Let me say a little bit more about Raj Pandya, who directs the American Geophysical Union's Thriving Earth Exchange. The Thriving Earth Exchange helps volunteer scientists and community leaders work together to use science, especially earth and space science, to advance community priorities related to sustainability, resilience, disaster risk reduction, and environmental justice. Raj works to welcome more people into guiding and doing science, especially from people from historically marginalized communities, so that science can contribute to a world where all people and nature can thrive now and in the future. So now to Raj.
Thank you very much, Mindy. And thank you, everyone, and good morning. My name is Raj. I'm sort of the leadoff hitter. So my job is just to get the ball into play and then let the heavy hitters come up to the plate and do the real work. But I'm excited to be the leadoff hitter, and maybe I can provide a little context. I'm really excited about this reemergence or emergence of a new way of doing science, a way of science that's anchored in collaboration with community groups, that's based on mutual respect and mutual learning. And we sort of think about this as community science. It's when community leaders and scientists work together using science and doing science to advance a community priority and to contribute back to the scientific enterprise. And it has enormous benefits to science and to communities. First, it translates science into action because it's designed for action. It begins with an intent to do something in a community, to do something of worth, and then it asks how science can be designed to to do that. And that's a pretty powerful strategy and a pretty different strategy from discovery-based modes of science. And I'm not I'm not criticizing discovery-based modes of science. I'm saying that there's room in the scientific enterprise for multiple approaches, and that community-based approaches are one of those approaches. The other thing it does is it expands public trust and participation in science. Um, People feel attached to science when they're part of generating the scientific questions and doing the scientific activities and collecting the scientific data. And we've seen how important public trust in science can be when we're facing crises. We've seen that very recently, for example. Um, it advances equity. One of the things community science can do, if it's intentional about it, is it can reach out to communities that have historically not had the opportunity or even been barred from participating in science. And it can ensure that all communities have the opportunity to ask and answer their scientific questions. And science can learn an enormous amount about justice and equity from working with communities who have been practicing justice and equity and advancing justice and equity in their work for decades. Science can actually become an ally for greater justice by working with these communities. So those are the things that I think are exciting about this notion of community science. This is what gets me excited about community science. And you'll hear a lot more from Adrian, Mimi, and Amy about what this looks like in practice and the details of how it works. What I think I just want to end with is a little bit about Thriving Earth Exchange. Thriving Earth Exchange was built to try to advance this notion of community science, to try to work towards a day when community science is as much a part of the scientific toolkit as numerical modeling or bench chemistry. That this is something that people learn how to do, that they're supported in doing, that there are mechanisms for community engagement, and that it's a way of sharing the power and the privilege of science with a much broader and more inclusive group of people in the United States and around the world. And so the way we do this in Thriving Earth Exchange is one community at a time. We sit down with community leaders, we try to understand where they're coming from, what they want to do, what they aspire to, and we try to match them with scientists who can help them achieve those goals. And we try to help those scientists and those community leaders work together to get things done in the community and in science. And we've done that about 150 times. This is one of those examples. Don't tell the other 149, but this is one of my favorite examples. Um, and I guess there's three big ideas that I think really guide our work and have emerged from this work with 150 communities. And the three big ideas are: always begin with community priorities. Community science is never about coming in and telling a community what they could do or what they should do. It's about asking a community what they want to do and then finding ways that science can help them do that. And that framing of priorities is really important. I had a mayor say to me once, "I'm tired of rich cities having priorities and poor cities having needs." We try to take an asset-based, agency-forward approach to everything we do, recognizing that communities have skills and attributes and knowledge and resources, and science can contribute to those skills and attributes and knowledge and resource. Second is end with community priorities, end with community impact. We tell our scientists that a paper is not an outcome. An outcome is something different in the community. It's something you work with the community leader to accomplish. You can write a paper about it, but don't confuse the paper with the outcome. And the third principle, so begin with community priorities, end with community impact. And the third important principle for us is foreground equity. I had a friend tell me once, if you're not advancing equity, you're allowing inequity to persist. And I think that's a guiding principle for all of our work. And with that, I think I'll wrap up and let you hear from Adrian, Mimi, and Amy. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Raj. That was extremely valuable in setting a framework in a very eloquent manner. All right, now I'd like to turn to Amy Stelly, and I will introduce her, and you will see why she's been such a pivotal presence in what's happened with the Claiborne Avenue Alliance. Amy is an artist, designer, planner, and teacher. Her scope of work includes building and open space design, historic restoration, downtown and neighborhood revitalization. The list goes on, and she encompasses so much, including environmental planning, zoning, entitlements, site planning, streetscape, and landscape design. All of these skills and talents and concerns have been pivotal in the work she's done looking at the Claiborne Avenue Alliance and its impact and where it could go to change. Her advocacy work with the Claiborne Avenue Alliance includes spearheading a recent study of community health outcomes for all living or working near urban highways. Amy's work with the Alliance made national headlines recently when the Claiborne Avenue Expressway was recognized as an example of, quote, historic inequity, close quote, by the Biden administration. That was a direct quote. Amy is a native of New Orleans and lives in Treme, where her family has resided for 4 generations. She's lectured on urban gardens and the history of planning and open space in Treme, and she's written about the value of community engagement and public accountability for the Lens, an online investigative publication. And now let's hear from Amy.
Thank you, Mindy, for such a great introduction. And thank you, Raj. I'm glad to know we're a favorite out of 150, one of the favorites. So thank you. um, Before I share my screen and show a little bit of the work that we've done, I'd like to say that with all of my talents and skills, and I'm very thankful for them, I don't think we would have gotten here without the community science, because the community science gave us the foundation to enter into the conversations with the federal government. One thing you have to do is prove your case, I've learned. And I think the community science was really the foundation of us proving our case that the expressway does need to come down because it's harmful, and then ultimately having the President Biden, not the administration, the president recognize us, which was a tremendous honor and testimony to our work. So without further ado, I would like to show you a little bit about what we've done. Okay, so this is about joining forces to document the hazards, which we did. About 3 years ago, the Claiborne Alliance pitched at the conference for the American Geophysical Union. We pitched to be a part of Thriving Earth, and that force became the Claiborne Alliance, LSU School of Public Health, and Thriving Earth was the matchmaker. And then Public Lab, who was also at our pitch session and decided that they wanted to work with us. So I was honored and grateful that Public Lab saw us as great partners. And ultimately, we added the Phyllis Wheatley fourth grade scientist to Truth, LSU's work, because the thinking was that if the work was accessible to a fourth grader, then it would be accessible to a broader population. And I think science needs to be accessible to all, particularly when it's a public health concern. So the goal of our collaboration was to document the adverse health impacts caused by urban highways, again, make science accessible to all, and involve citizens who normally would not be included in those discussions. Our work, whether it was on the graduate level or on the elementary level, consisted of classroom work, field work, developing findings, and then ultimately publishing those works. And both LSU published their findings, and you can see this is on our Claiborne Avenue Alliance website, excuse me. And this is the cover of the book that Phyllis Wheatley authored about their findings. You can see this is, of course, the Phyllis Wheatley classroom, but our field trip, sorry, my mouse is very sensitive. Our field trip actually to Claiborne there. So a little bit about the Claiborne Corridor. This is where we are. The Claiborne Corridor stretches the breadth of New Orleans. It runs from parish line to parish line. We have parishes, most states have counties. And the portion of I-10 that we're very concerned about is in green, and it's circled and runs from the Central Business District through the residential section of the 7th Ward, and then it actually transverses the Claiborne Avenue corridor in Treme. Next slide. The thing that was most heartbreaking about the introduction of the interstate was the destruction of our oak trees. 200 oak trees were removed from North Claiborne Avenue the day after Mardi Gras. And Mardi Gras is all about revelry and having fun with family and friends. And then the next day, devastation hit the community. And I tell you, it has scarred the community for over 50 years. Next slide. A little bit about the kids' work. Part of their introduction to the community science piece was understanding the history of the neighborhood. And this is an example of how they digested and then gave back that history. Next slide. Environmental menace. The highway is a menace. Jamie, if you would click, there's a video and you can see it range through the deck. This video was taken by a photographer, Derek Waldrip, and he is with our CBS affiliate. It's part of a bigger documentary that he did on Claiborne Avenue, but the interstate has not been maintained in 50 years. So when it rains through the deck, and then we are the recipients of the dirty, nasty runoff. So toxic water is clearly a public health threat. And when it floods, it's even worse because people ride bikes in New Orleans. Sometimes that's the only way they can get around. So they ride through this toxic water. Next slide. You can see how the kids then digested the information about Claiborne being an environmental menace, which I call it. They documented the flooding, and the trees in the corridor are dark. You can see in places where the particulate matter has just stuck to the trees, and the trunks, instead of being nice and healthy and brown, are streaked or coated in some cases with black. Next slide, please. Loss of our economic engine. More than 100 businesses were taken out by the interstate. On my left, you can see a picture of a favorite drugstore, the LaBranch drugstore. I remember it for its beautiful black and white, tiny hexagonal tiles. It just stuck in my memory. I guess that's why I'm an architect. And then you can see on the right a picture that I took not long ago of another section. This is not where the drugstore is, it's a little bit further east. But in the background, there is a funeral home. And death is a recession-proof business, but the funeral homes in the corridor have even closed because it's not good business. Next slide. And you can see again how the children digested the fact that the businesses were there and it was a thriving Black-owned economy. Next slide. Loss of affordable housing. I think this is the most heartbreaking section of I-10, where it goes through the 7th Ward, which was typically the home of our craftsmen and artisan. It just wiped out hundreds of houses, 500 homes, and it left an area dark and desolate. And you can see where the interstate almost hugs people's houses, and that's not good because we know what it brings. Next slide, please. And of course, the children, again, giving us back that information. This is one of my favorite illustrations that says, "You must leave for I-10." And the person is, "Oh no, why?" And I can hear children feeling that way and listening to their parents express despair if they were told that they would have to leave home really for anything, but especially a huge piece of infrastructure. Next slide, please. A lot of public health threats. We have lots of illegal activities, prostitution, drug use, and then homelessness. And I list them as a public health threat because under COVID, folks are living communally. I know for a fact the camp that's under the bridge is a half block from my house, and there are intravenous drug users there. Day before yesterday, I had to help one out of the middle of the street before she got hit. I got her to get onto the sidewalk. She crossed the street and then proceeded to stand in the street again. So I decided to help her out. I called 911. She got angry at me, so I left her alone. But clearly, this is a dangerous situation. More so for the homeless, I have to say, because she wasn't even aware that she was in danger. And that's really sad and heartbreaking. Next slide, please. The activity under the ramps is really horrible. Could you click, Jamie? This is a video that was taken by my children a couple of years ago. Nothing has changed. I don't know, can you turn up the sound? I don't know if we can hear it, but they're just commenting on the number of needles that have been left there. Yeah, I don't think we can hear the sound, but this is an area where parents walk with children. This video was taken when the weather was relatively warm in New Orleans. You can wear open shoes most of the year. And imagine if you were walking with a child and they stuck their feet. But this is behind a ramp that's about 2 blocks from my house. So I live near 2 ramps. You can just a little bit. Okay, if you could advance, Jamie. So the study area for the for our science was 300 feet from the elevated deck, which is about a city block. City blocks are roughly 300 feet long. Next slide. You can see LSU found that there are a lot of health impacts from emissions, respiratory disease, cardiovascular, adverse birth outcomes. And you can see how the kids then digested that same information. And Adrian took them out and taught them how to use monitors so that they were able to monitor the air near their school. And then they monitored as they got closer and closer to the expressway and documented the changes over the course of about 5 blocks. Next slide. More findings. The noise, I can tell you from living here, is constant. It's 24 hours a day. It's horrible on the weekends because the motorcycles go until 3 a.m. and other speed racers. Again, On my left, the findings of one of Adrian's students documenting the noise. And actually, this is the more quiet section of the corridor. It is on the western end, close to the LSU School of Public Health. I live more east, and there's a lot more activity there, particularly at night. Again, you can see how the kids digested this. You know, it's so loud, be quiet. This is what I say at night when I'm trying to sleep and nobody's listening. Next slide. Click again, please. Lead in the soil, of course, you know, the pollutants from the interstate are contaminated. Lead is part of that. And then you can see how the kids then digested that runoff pollutants from the interstate are poisoning the soil and water, which is true. Next slide. And finally, as a conclusion, I have called for a plan for equity as we remove I-10, because I think that's the only way to justly repair the corridor, repair the economy, and of course, repair the lives that were, you know, so devastated by the installation of the interstate. And you can see that the kids concluded, without me or Adrian or any other adult, that if we tear down the interstate, we could have our green space back, trees and garden. And we know in the age of COVID that that is vitally important, especially in communities of color. And again, we were stripped of our green space and we are calling to have it returned. On my left, you can see a drawing that I did a couple of years ago that actually looks at how green Claiborne would be if the interstate were removed, which is the long, more, I guess, vertical or diagonal going north strip. And then the Lafitte Greenway is a new park. So we would have an intersection of a lot of green spaces, which I think would restore the health and ultimately restore equity in our community. And with that, I will pass the torch.
Okay, thank you so much, Amy. Lots of fascinating information and fascinating research by the students, some of whom will surely grow up and go into some degree of scientific effort to be determined as they get older. Okay, now I want to turn to someone who is trained as a scientist and is also very deeply embedded in community life and community engagement, and that is Mimi Spahn-Sattler. Let me briefly introduce Mimi. She's the education manager of Public Lab, where she works to develop and expand the organization's educational programming and to build a network of educators interested in making their classrooms part of the Public Lab community. Mimi joins the team with experience in laboratory science as well as K through 12 education. Her work at Public Lab allows her to live out her dream of making science accessible for everyone. She has a BA in neuroscience from the University of Southern California and earned her master's in cell and molecular biology at a New Orleans institution, Tulane University. And now let's hear directly from Mimi.
Hi, y'all. My name is Mimi, and I'm calling in from New Orleans, Louisiana. I use she, her pronouns, and just like Mindy said, I'm the education manager at Public Lab. So just a little bit about Public Lab and what we do. So we're a nonprofit housed within a global community, and collectively we have the goal of pursuing environmental justice through community science and open technology. At Public Lab, we look at community science as community-led scientific exploration and investigation that's addressing community-defined questions. And this process allows for engagement by the community in all of the entirety of the scientific process. We're really rooted in the belief that the best ideas and solutions come from collaborations between on-the-ground communities with deep knowledge of local issues, and that those communities can work in close, equitable, and sustainable partnerships with networks that can bring skills, capacity, science, and technology to bear. So Public Lab was founded in the wake of the 2010 BP oil disaster during an information blackout for residents and the rest of the world. In response to the spill, a group of concerned locals, environmental advocates, designers, and social scientists lofted community satellites made from balloons, kites, and digital cameras over the spill to collect real-time data about its impact. As the education manager at Public Lab, I work to translate this work of the community for use in classrooms, which I had the opportunity to do here with Amy and Adrienne. Just like those original Public Labbers flew balloons to learn about an environmental disaster, the students were able to do that same thing. So they launched their own DIY satellites with balloons and cameras. The cameras were running on a Raspberry Pi platform, and so students were able to view the images in real time. And using this technology, students are able to make their own maps of the area. These maps are high resolution, a much higher resolution than you can get from satellite data, but also that these students are able to annotate these maps with their own hyper-local knowledge, things that you couldn't get from a satellite image or that you might not be able to find from someone who's coming into the community and not deeply embedded in it. So students are able to say that it rains through the Claiborne overpass, which you wouldn't know if you were just driving through on a sunny day or coming in from another area to work. They can note that there's a puddle that forms here after the rain and it stays for 6 to 10 days, which is something that you wouldn't find in a one-time survey. So bringing that local knowledge to bear from these students and from community members, we're able to help to advance the investigation and direct it in a way that really reflects the needs of the community and the knowledge of the community. So yeah, sorry, I really love doing this project. I really enjoy getting to work with students and see them have ownership of the data of the process. When we were flying balloons that are 6 feet wide or really large kites in these areas, a lot of students haven't flown a kite before. I know myself, I was born and raised in New Orleans and I had no experience with flying something like that. So for many students, it's the first time that you're able to be connected to something that is, rising up in the air, that's attracting community attention and building on that movement in the moment, doing that field work. So thanks so much for having me as a part of this project. I'm looking forward to discussing it more with the folks on this call today. And with that, I am going to pass things over to Mindy.
Okay, thank you. And I hope we'll hear more about your work with the 4th grade students. And now we'll turn to Adrienne. And I want to introduce Dr. Adrienne Kattner, who is an assistant professor in environmental and occupational health at Louisiana State University's Health Sciences Center School of Public Health. She has a broad background in public health with specific training in exposure and risk assessment and environmental health policy. Her research focuses on evaluating how effective federal drinking water regulations and prevailing public health guidelines are in reducing water contaminant exposures. She recently received an early career research fellowship from the National Academy of Sciences. Her work with communities has also been recognized by area nonprofits with a Katrina Hero Award, maybe it should be Heroine Award, for Environmental Justice and Community Angel Award. Adrienne.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me explain what we have done on this project. I'm Adrienne Kattner from Louisiana State University. When we were contacted by Tex, I was excited because this particular project had personal significance to me. But when we got together with the community, we came up with a plan, a strategy on how we were going to go about documenting the hazards and exposures and risks in this community. So we knew we wanted to we didn't have any money. So this is all pro bono. And we had to therefore rely a lot on the community support and student support to collect data. And that is exactly what we did. So again, just sort of going back into the personal issues about this, my father, who was the director of the city's planning commission, and the year after this was actually implemented, and the I-10 was constructed. At the time, I don't believe that they had any idea of the huge impact that this structure would cause this really culturally significant and important community of Treme. This is where Creole culture began. This is where our food, Creole food, was born, where jazz was born. And by the construction of this interstate, it really impacted a very important neighborhood, not just for the city, but for the country. So we weren't trying to reinvent the wheel. We didn't have any money for analysis, so we had to use what we had available. And there is a slew of literature already published showing significant associations between traffic pollution and health impacts. And so part of our job was to translate that information to both the stakeholders, being the community, and also the decision makers of the city council members. So we had our students go out to collect some air samples using the Delos air sampler that we had available to us to monitor particulate matter air concentrations. We reviewed a lot of the literature and summarized it. We also looked at any available data on air pollutant and soil lead levels that we could find from other researchers. We documented the noise levels and also identified exposure pathways. So Amy's sort of gone into this, and it's not, again, we're not reinventing the wheel here, but we did make this information more accessible through education and other pamphlets and other things. But I wanted to sort of give you guys an idea of, just how loud this area can be. So I have here, in my show really quickly, just an example of the noise that you hear in this neighborhood all the time. I guess it says it can't play, so I will keep on going. But just so you know, it is very loud. Not only are there hospitals in the area, so you hear a lot of ambulances, but there's also a lot of trucks. And so it's constant noise. And this is 24/7. So the community not only are suffering from the problems of air pollution from traffic, and also from the flooding due to the concrete and the inability of the water to permeate the soil, but you're also suffering from light hazards, light pollution, and also noise pollution. So it's not just air pollution. So another part of this project really relied on not only documenting the hazards, but also documenting the exposures. And so part of that was documenting where the daycares, the parks, the schools, how close are these homes to the interstate. And we were able to do that with photographs and just walking around and getting to understand what was going on in the community. So this is something I share with all of my students. In order to do a proper risk assessment, you have to walk around the community and really understand how people are being exposed. And not just through flooding, but looking at how proximal these homes are, looking at other people who are living, and I'm talking about the homeless here, who are living in these conditions. Another thing was they wanted to build a children's park underneath the interstate. This was going to be very problematic for developing lungs to be exposed to this pollution. There's also gardens and other nearby, right underneath the I-10. And then there are places where you can buy food right under the I-10. And this never stopped being a community area. So the community still congregates under the I-10. It still congregate right there on that what we call a neutral ground. And so the exposures, it's unlike any other area that I've ever seen, because the community still continues to meet there and on a regular basis. So we were able to look at some of the health data that we could get our hands onto, but again, this was very preliminary. It was not an in-depth epidemiological study, but we did see higher than expected levels of respiratory disease and cardiovascular disease, which is significantly associated with traffic health. And so it wasn't very surprising to see that. So there's still a lot of data that we don't have. We don't know a lot about cancer. We don't know how these exposures might be impacting reproductive or developmental health effects. Are they having any kind of neurological impact or immunological impact? We know from the recent literature on COVID and air pollution that, they're most likely in these places that are highly polluted, we may be seeing decreased immune abilities in some of the people who live around these areas. So I'm going to stop there because I think that really this project would not have come about if it hadn't been for Amy Stelly bringing this issue forward. Again, this was a very personal thing. I wanted to investigate it as soon as I transferred from the School of Public Health into academia, but I didn't have the community behind me at that point. And so having the community come to me and bring this issue before me really gave me that opportunity. Even if we didn't have grant money, we were still able to do something.
Okay, well, thank you, Adrian, very much. There was a lot to think about in what you presented. And now I would like to go back to Amy to take us from the documentation and the field work that was done by a rich array of people, including the 4th grade students at Phyllis Wheatley, Adrian, her colleagues, her students, and of course, Amy and other community members. And for Amy to tell us what happened with what was found, where did it go, how is it shared, and where do things stand now?
Interesting. So Adrian and I were able to present to the City Council's Transportation Committee in 2019, just before COVID hit. And I have to tell you, that was a huge step because they would not listen to me before. And I pushed and pushed and pushed until we finally got an audience with the City Council. And I have to call it, an audience because that's what it was. But actually the City Councilwoman who invited us, Kristen Palmer, told me a couple of days ago that we actually moved the City Council because we left them with no argument, which was actually a surprise to hear because that was not really expressed when we were there. I don't know if Adrian sensed that we changed some hearts and minds, but at the time, I have to tell you, I didn't. And then COVID hit and things just kind of went dead. We did do a campaign, a poster campaign, and you can see the poster on the Claiborne Avenue Alliance website. And it was really just to raise awareness of what we lost, what we were faced with, and what we could look forward to. Fast forward, things, of course, have been quiet. And all of a sudden, President Biden calls out Claiborne in his infrastructure rollout. And I think we all went from being real nerds to actually being glamorous, which is, very difficult to process, that infrastructure and public health are now really concerns of the day, and rightly so. So I am hopeful that now that the country is paying attention to public health issues, that is, I have to say, one of the good things about COVID. It made us very much aware of public health and what that means and what it entails. And it also made us very aware of the importance of our open space. So I am hoping that all of this attention and awareness now translates into the removal of the highway. And I'm really, really hopeful because the president will be in New Orleans on Thursday. And my greatest dream would be for him to take a ride down Claiborne to really see for himself. But I don't think we would have gotten here without the science, because the science, as I said, when I started, was really, it gave us a foundation to actually talk about the adverse impacts of the highway. I can tell you the planning discussion wasn't really going very far because people didn't care, but the public health discussion has really carried us far. So I'm very thankful for it.
Amy, where do you see specific next steps? There is receptivity. That's a sort of a vague phrase, which can mean everything or nothing. But how can you move this further?
Well, actually, now that we are on everybody's radar, I'm working with a nonprofit to actually do a community forum so that we can conduct a citywide conversation about the, you know, adverse impacts of living near this type of infrastructure. It's convenient for some, and it's not even convenient anymore because people will crawl along the elevated deck, but then on the surface road, which is below, because Claiborne by and large is still intact, you can still see the median under there.
Just a note, we're having some really bad weather here in New Orleans. I know that Amy is calling in from home, as am I. I just had a brief flash of my electricity, and she may have had the same.
Oh my gosh.
As you guys might be gleaning, infrastructure is not really our strong suit here in.
Okay. Well, while we're waiting to get Amy back, I think it would be good for Mimi and Adrian to say a little bit about the after effects as they see them of the testimony before the city council and the political climate now.
I was taken aback when we did present it before the city council. There wasn't a, other than one particular city council woman, there wasn't a lot of sort of receptivity to the idea of taking the I-10 down. And I think part of that is either business interests, being the Port of New Orleans, or others that are against it. But also, there's also a strong community, movement against it too, because of the fear of gentrification. These are low income renters, people with, really minimum wage jobs. They're afraid that they're going to lose their rentals if they take down this I-10, because then the property values will go up. And we saw a little bit of gentrification in this area, actually a lot, right after Katrina, where we had a lot of people, developers coming in from the north and other areas, buy up this property. And now we have $1 million homes, in community that, you'd be lucky to get a house, for under 100,000, because it just has been so dilapidated for so long. And so we have to address that issue before anything happens. We have to address the community's concerns of gentrification before going forward. And right now, Amy and I are working with some students on policies, looking at policies that other cities have created and done to see what would be the best approach for it. I see that Amy is back on now. Maybe she could talk about her land trusts.
Yeah, I know. We're having a thunderstorm, and the infrastructure in New Orleans obviously is not great, which is why the president is coming, because this is a regular occurrence here. So I apologize, but nature did its thing. Raj, why don't you comment, and then I can pick up since I lost a piece of the discussion.
Yeah, I'm gonna switch a little bit if nobody minds. There's a question in the chat or in the Q&A that really kind of got me thinking, and the question's sort of around, how do we prevent these kinds of injustices going forward? As we think about things like new infrastructure, green infrastructure, what are the ways that we can avoid repeating racist practices moving forward? And I'm wondering, what advice would you have for scientists, for anyone who wanted to get involved in kind of what's happening next and make sure it happens in a good way?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll jump in. I would have to say that you can't be afraid to, number one, talk about racism. Because if you're afraid, then that's a barrier to actually solving the problem. And this is something that I was faced with recently in New Orleans, where the discussion came up and people were just afraid to talk about it. So they opted out, which means they'll sort of never come along, is what I'm thinking, or it's going to be very difficult for them to come along. But once we are comfortable talking about racism, then we will become more comfortable talking about racist practices, which have to be undone, because whether we like it or not, they're embedded in American culture. It was the country was founded on racism. I mean, we all have to agree with that, or we wouldn't have had slavery, and we would not have declared Black people a fraction of white people. So we have to really look at the roots of racism and decide that we don't want to be there anymore. And then I think the practice, whether it is in policy planning, creating the built environment. I mean, the built environment in communities like Treme and the Seventh Ward, it's a weapon because it's harmful. So we've got to have the conversation to actually begin to undo it. And also our leaders have to be willing to give up old ways of thinking. Shreveport and Lafayette, Louisiana, and Monroe are currently fighting the Claibornes because the state of Louisiana wants to do the same thing in communities of color in those three cities. And I don't understand why, particularly under the Biden administration. The president has already given us a signal that he wants change, but the state of Louisiana and Texas, fortunately, Secretary Buttigieg stopped the highways in Houston, but in Louisiana, there is no intention of stopping. They intend to repeat the process. So they're not keeping up with the conversation. They're not really making themselves fully aware of what these things do. So we're going to go through another cycle of racist planning and racist policies if we don't stop. Fortunately for Louisiana, the four corners of the state have joined together to look at new transportation policies for the state, because we all recognize, and this is a coalition of Black and white people, we all recognize that this is not the answer to transportation, nor is it the answer to community building. So we've all got to change. But if our leadership doesn't change, then we have many, many more years of struggle. So I'm very hopeful that this new administration will also then encourage state governments and local governments to actually think differently, particularly about transportation and infrastructure.
Amy, are there any national associations that are coming together, bringing communities facing what you face to talk to each other and share ideas and strategies?
Yeah, actually, the Congress for the New Urbanism is doing that. There's a coalition of freeway fighters, and we are now talking. It's a national coalition. So that is something that people should check out. Smart Mobility has some very good teachings on things like urban highways and what they do. So the national planning and design interest groups are actually coming together and bringing people together who are interested in those topics. What we need is for the conversation to actually move from the intelligentsia onto the ground, because the people on the ground need to understand what these things do to them, because that's really where the fight is, on the ground. If we tell the politicians no, they're going to listen. And even if they don't, if we continue to tell them no, and we have had this experience in New Orleans, if you just say no, and if you say it loudly enough, you can push them back. People don't realize their power. I'm trying to make folks in the neighborhood realize you have more power than you think, a lot more.
Okay, we have some interesting questions here, and all of you can take a shot. There's a question by a student scientist who wants to know how she can contribute to the science and policy of contaminated stormwater in Louisiana. So Any thoughts about how you could involve interested students who may not even be from Louisiana in your work?
Ooh. Anybody else? Any?
Yeah, so I have some ideas on this one, in that much of the way that Public Lab organizes is online. And one of the things that we provide is our website, which is set up as an online, public laboratory notebook, essentially, where you can ask questions, share your data, you can share and provide feedback on others, but also that you can take your, we refer to them as activities, but you can take a protocol and post it, and folks can participate in that protocol, all over the world. But in sharing knowledge, we can really help to push these things forward. Like Amy said, folks need to know what's going on. So stepping out in your own community and saying, okay, I can investigate these things. What kind of tools do I have? And how can I convene my own community? And then once I have that community convening and we have created knowledge, how am I sharing that out to better communities elsewhere as well? That, and Raj hit on this in the beginning, that, the endpoint isn't a paper, the endpoint isn't, just learning something new, but taking that knowledge, applying it and sharing it. The community that you're embedded in can have it, but also like you can share that out with a global community who can learn from projects like Amy's, to do something similar to help meet the needs that they have as well.
Thank you. We've posted on the chat the website of Public Lab, and I think that there will be warm welcome to anyone who reaches out to Mimi for advice and guidance. We have a very interesting question from Teresa Harris from AAAS. She asks, what surprised you when all of you started working together? What changed about the collaboration as a result of these surprises?
Well, I can tell you what surprised me. What surprised me most was that Adrienne and I had similar childhood, I want to say, feelings, not necessarily experiences, about the interstate. She was affected by her dad's position as a planning director, and I was affected just by living here. So when we came together, it was really fate. I think I've said that many times, because it's not often that you find community and science who are scientists who are affected by the same thing, but in different ways, and who can come together to actually look for a solution. So that was actually my greatest surprise. And then another surprise I have to tell you was actually being selected to do community science work, with Thriving Earth, because when I go to these things, I always think nobody wants to hear about the interstate, because you get treated like a nut, basically when you talk about taking a highway down. So it was very much an honor and a surprise to get selected. I'm very happy that we pitched and we were successful, but those were my two biggest surprises. And of course I have very deep affection for Public Lab because of what they do. And they really engage the children in a way that I don't think they would have been engaged in the classroom. Being able to fly a giant red balloon was something that they probably had never done before, but they may do again, and also may get them very interested in becoming scientists. So those were the really great takeaways from my experience.
Anyone else want to chime in here?
I have to say that I was really happy that this particular project, which got no funding, has no journal publications, has actually been the most productive in terms of getting the message out and hopefully initiating a conversation nationally about highways and the destruction that it's done in these communities. And that couldn't have happened without AGU Techs. And so I can't overestimate the importance of what part they played in bringing Amy and I together.
I think that will be something that Raj will remember. We don't have too much more time, but Elizabeth Fleischer asks, What will happen to the traffic currently on I-10? And a broader question, what is the best philosophy of where highways should be placed?
Well, I can tell you, studies have shown in other cities that the traffic disperses through the street grid. And New Orleans is very, very lucky. We are a city of boulevards. They're all connected. So you can take one boulevard to another and actually get through the city in less time than it takes for you to go to the interstate, take the interstate to wherever, you know, you might get stopped or held up because of a traffic jam, and then you reach your destination. So the traffic will disperse. This has been shown. And I can tell you, very often, most people are on the highway deck and the street grid is empty. I drive it all the time because I've vowed to only take the highway when I have to. So I think it will work. What was the other part of her question?
Well, she wanted to know what will happen to the existing traffic
Yeah,
on the overpass.
yeah.
And
I thought
then-
there was
Yeah.
I thought there was a part two.
Yeah, the part two is where should highways be placed?
Preferably in belts around cities where there are no people living. And I think what we've seen is that when these highways are built through areas that aren't inhabited, things spring up around them. You know, I drove a lot between Florida and Louisiana over a 20-year period, and you could see the Home Depots and all of the strip malls that kind of pop up to support the highways. But that is a choice that those developers made. We did not make that choice. So I think that, you know, as we plan highways, we need to make sure that they're being placed where they won't harm people. It has to be a people first strategy with transportation, not a car first.
And
Yes,
if I may,
yeah.
to not pile on, but to add a bit there, right? As another person who was born and raised in New Orleans, I mean, I can plus one everything Amy said. I avoid the interstate like the plague. You know, it's not something that you have to get on here to get anywhere. And it's typically something that will be slower than going in any other direction. You know, but when we think about where do we place interstates in the future, you know, one, like we can't place them without community consent, like Amy is saying here.
Right.
You know, we can choose to move towards the interstate, but many people don't have the resources to choose to move away. You know, and then I think that there's, you know, we're maybe asking the wrong questions when we think, okay, well, where should we put highways? You know, in a city like New Orleans, we thought about where to put the highway. What we haven't thought about and what we don't have here are, you know, public transit systems that work, that can fit the high capacity. You know, we need to be thinking about alternatives to highways, especially living in a city that is at the forefront of, you know, the climate crisis. You know, the climate's been changed here and we have to learn to adapt and move with it. You know, New Orleans was built on the swamp. You don't come to the swamp and expect it to be dry, but the way that our current infrastructure system exists, we do expect it to stay dry. You know, but that's not the case here. So, you know, we need community consent, but I think we need to be asking bigger questions on not where can we move the highway to, but how can we eliminate the need for this highway and put in green options moving forward, you know, which I think here in New Orleans, you know, as much as we need to invest in our street infrastructure, we need to invest in our public transportation options for folks who use it.
Yeah, that's a great reframing, Mimi. We have two more questions that I'd like to at least get in. One by Ivel, maybe, Gontan. And what would you say are some of the biggest challenges in collaborating with scientists? But I can add that scientists collaborating with community. We've talked about surprises. We've talked about things found in common that strengthen the collaboration. But what are some of the challenges? Maybe there are none. Maybe the synergy works so well that things are proceeding much more smoothly with no real jagged edges.
Yeah, I would have to say I thought we did well as a trio. The biggest bump we had actually was with the teacher at Phyllis Wheatley. She didn't want us in her classroom, you know, and she was pretty adamant. It was a lot of communication challenges with that particular team member, but I think ultimately, and I've said this time after time, I think it was better for me because then the science stood alone. None of the three of us influenced the kids' findings. They took the history, they took the science, they digested it and gave it back to us. But I think as a team, Claiborne Public Lab and LSU, we worked well together. The biggest challenge is coordinating everybody's schedule so that we could meet. And we met regularly, which did make a difference. I think people who think they can meet, every 2 or 3 months for a check-in, it doesn't work like that. And I credit Adrienne for really driving that train and tasking her students and giving them deadlines and then making them report, because that kept the work going. So I thought we actually were a great match.
So the interplay with Adrienne's students and the community worked well because you had new people coming in, some of whom perhaps lived in different parts of the city or maybe weren't even from New Orleans altogether. So they were learning some things about the community they never knew before.
True, and truthfully, when I just want to add one thing, when the students didn't work well, Adrienne knew. So it was a good collaboration.
Well, I just wanted to note too that, what we're seeing here is really like an exemplary case of science and community working together. What Adrienne has done in coming in and doing work that wasn't grant funded, that didn't have a bunch of papers, that wasn't going to add letters behind her name, and putting that importance on, I want to work with the community because I know that working with that community has value, is something that we don't see a lot. We don't see it rewarded in scientific institutions, and so we're getting a very special scientist here in Adrienne as well, and someone that is willing to do this work. And that's, one of the things that we really need more of. And I was wondering, Raj, if you might talk a little bit to the way that Thriving Earth Exchange works to find these exemplary scientists and to connect with people who have this interest in doing community work.
Yeah, I would do that. And I also just want to second that there are structural barriers that make it hard for scientists like Adrienne to do this work and be rewarded for it and be encouraged for it. We don't train our graduate students in the kinds of collaborative skills they need to be good partners. We don't reward people. I think it's ironic that we fund scientists to go find community groups to work with instead of funding community groups to go find scientists to work with. I think that could be a radical change that could really elevate this work. That said, like one of the biggest surprises for me is the hunger for young scientists, and not just young scientists, but scientists of all ages to do this work. I think, we always are dreading that we won't be able to find a scientific partner to work with the community, or we won't be able to find somebody to do this volunteer work, and we're always oversubscribed. We typically have twice as many applicants for opportunities as we do opportunities. So I think there's a hunger for this kind of work within the scientific community, and people bring the skills to the table. The way we actually work to find scientists is we sit down with community leaders and we understand kind of what the priorities are. We design together a project that will advance those priorities. And then we write together a job description saying, these are the skills we're looking for in a scientist. And the job description includes technical skills. It also includes collaborative social skills, cultural skills. And then we advertise that job description and we look for volunteers. When we find somebody who says they're interested, we have a phone call with them and a conversation and ask them questions about, what does anti-racism look like in your work? How would you handle a situation like this? What kinds of experiences have you brought to the table? When have you done this kind of work before? And only when we've sort of identified someone who has demonstrated a kind of an understanding of the philosophy of community science, only then do we introduce them to the community leader and say, this looks like a good match for you. And the community leader always gets the right to say, nah, not so much. This isn't a great fit. So does that answer your question, Mimi?
Yes, I think so. Thanks so much, Raj.
Thank you.
But Raj, before we let you go, how do you identify the communities in the first place? The United States is filled with so many different communities. how do you begin to narrow down this universe?
So the biggest thing we've learned is that, or the most successful strategy we've had, is to partner with organizations that know communities and know communities well. So we don't reach out directly to a community necessarily. We reach out to the International County Managers Association, or the National League of Cities, or the Anthropocene Alliance, which is a grassroots coalition of anti-flooding groups. And those folks have the trust and the relationships with communities, and they can say to those communities, to their partners, these Thriving Earth Exchange folks are worth talking to. They're not whack jobs. They're not like every other science organization that approached you. I hope they don't actually say that, but something like that. And that gives us entree, and that gives us credibility when we walk in the room. And then we work hard to live up to that introduction. And the most gratifying thing for us is when, we more and more we're having communities come to us and say, I'm friends with this person, and they said they worked with you and it went well, so I wanted to work with you too.
That speaks well. We've gotten a note from someone named Bevan Watten. I hope I'm not massacring this, who is very interested, and she hopes we may find a way to build a bridge with IIIS and with Thriving Earth Exchange to work with you. So I guess they could write to you, Raj, and you could take it from there. One last quick question, and then we do have a survey with 4 questions. Won't take you very long that IIIS has prepared, and I'll get to that in a minute. But we have a question about sharing the research findings by analytical labs that municipalities might work with to release raw data on toxicity and a whole lot of other detrimental effects of infrastructure work. And how can this then be channeled so that the public can know what's going on? Not everyone is fortunate to have Amy and Mimi and Adrian in their communities to catalyze this work. So how can city governments be catalyzed to start releasing negative data?
So a little bit to this, many cities do release this data. The difficulty is that what we lack in our communities is some of the data literacy. It's released in just like, okay, here's a bunch of raw data, but if you walk up to 10 people on a city block, the chances that 3 out of 10 of them are going to know what to do with this and how to work with this, especially in states like Louisiana, cities like New Orleans, where our STEM education is lacking. You're not going to find someone who can do it. So it's not just about releasing the data, it's about communicating it and building these skills in the community so that we know what to do with that data. Additionally, that data is hard to find. Some of these databases seem to be intentionally made difficult to search so that folks can't find what they need to do.
And
Amy, you have something to say about that?
Actually, I agree with Mimi because the city has collected a lot of the data that I have used in my argument. But the only reason I was able to find it was because I was lucky enough to be part of the beta testing because I was affiliated with a group that was doing it. But if I had not been affiliated with that group, I would not have known that the city had collected that data, mapped it, and it was available for public use. And when I tell people about it, they are surprised. Folks are now kind of catching up to it, but things like climate and health data, the city of New Orleans has had that information for years, but it has not been released and very few people know about it. So we do have to make it accessible. And one thing cities have to face is that when they're not doing a good job of protecting people, then they have to do something about it. And part of the way government works is that once the CEO is notified, then it is incumbent upon them to take action to really mitigate the harm. So if the people don't know that they're being harmed, then cities don't have to do anything. So you have to think about it. So we have to demand that cities are transparent with all of this kinds of data. And as Mimi said, it just can't be raw. You have to make it digestible so that people understand what's going on.
Absolutely. And here's where working with the media is important. The local newspaper, getting them to have a beat that covers these kind of things, keeping ongoing relationships. Raj, do you want to say a final word in terms of where the Thriving Earth Exchange is going? Anything about some future plans? And then we will give everybody some chance to digest the fascinating material that we've heard for the past hour.
So I guess the thing that gets me excited, the thing that sort of, I really do believe that there's kind of a rediscovery or a reemergence that this kind of collaborative approach to science can enrich, can be valuable for communities, it can be valuable for cities, it can be valuable for science. And I think there's an increasing interest in how we work together to make this happen. And there's a willingness to sort of blow apart some of the old boundaries and the old rules and see if we can invent some new rules and new boundaries. And so I'm really imagining a day where, you know, when someone says they're a scientist, that could mean that they're a researcher in a lab. It could mean that they're a community member working on a project. It could mean that they're a teacher in a classroom. And all of those kinds of being a scientist are equally valid and equally recognized and equally honored. And sort of the thing that I'd like to do with Thriving Earth Exchange is we focus on helping people connect to geoscientists. I'd like to build an alliance with other kinds, other disciplines, so that we can start to work across disciplines and help communities connect with not just a geoscientist, but a geoscientist and a civil engineer and a public health expert and a teacher, and really pull from the expertise in and around the community to build multidisciplinary teams that are pulling science into community priorities in a way that, as a partner.
Well, thank you for a very eloquent answer. And I hope some people on this call will think about contacting the Thriving Earth Exchange and working with their mayors and city councils. We'll give more business to Raj. Okay, well, thank you. This was fascinating. It's been recorded so people can come back to this and hear a lot that they may not have completely absorbed the first time around. And now we have a slide about opportunities to view the past webinars. I think that's on your screen, and someone who can take your questions about the whole series that AAAS has on these webinars is Oliver Moles, and his email is posted, ocmoles@gmail.com. And now, if you want to have the webinar survey posted so that you can let us know what you think of the past hour, perhaps Jamie can put that up so that people can see the survey writ large.
It's in the chat.
All right, everybody go to the chat then. Thank you all so much.